The Trojans are in full retreat. Achilles drives half the Trojan army back towards Troy over the plains, but the other half is driven into the Xanthus River. Achilles, who leaps into the waters, slaughters Trojans until his arms grow tired, at which point he captures 12 Trojans for Patroclus's funeral. Achilles, insane to hack more flesh, returns to the river and kills Lycaon, a Trojan hugging his knees for mercy. Achilles kills Aster, or call him Aster. He kills Aster, the son of the river god Axius, who was ambidextrous and fought with 2 spears. He still died, though.
I like guys who are like I like characters that are ambidextrous. I just like people who are ambidextrous.
Well, that's good.
Fun fact.
We're moving on. The river Xanthus takes human shape, and the river god cries out to Achilles, "All my lovely rapids are crammed with corpses now. Leave me alone. I am filled with horror." Achilles agrees, but then overhears the river god Xanthus asking Apollo to help the Trojans. Achilles plunges into the river's heart to war against him, and Xanthus beats and batters Achilles down with roaring waves. Achilles cries out to Zeus not to let him die like some pig boy who failed to ford the river. It's a wonderful scene. And Poseidon and Athena do save him. Xanthus tries to attack Achilles again on the flooded, corpse-ridden plains of Troy, but Hera sends Hephaestus to save him. The god of fire scorches the plains, consuming water and corpses alike. Xanthus cries out to Hera to relent. Zeus was delighted to see the gods in conflict. Athena once again defeats Ares and then batters down Aphrodite when she tries to help him. Poseidon challenges Apollo, but Apollo refuses to fight. Artemis, his sister, mocks Apollo, and having caught the attention of Hera, she is subsequently beaten down by Zeus's consort. Hermes tells Leto he will not fight her and allows her to take her daughter, Artemis, up to Olympus. Apollo heads to Troy to help them not fall to the Achaeans, and the book ends with Apollo saving Agenor from Achilles, but then taking on the appearance of the Trojan and leading Achilles on a chase away from Troy.
Welcome to the Great Books Podcast. We are Ascend, the Great Books Podcast. Check us out on social media, on our website. We have multiple different URLs saved so that way you cannot not find us. 2 negatives, I understand. You can find us. TheGreatBooksPodcast.com, Ascend, TheGreatBooksPodcast.com. We're all over the webs. We figured out, you know what? The internet is here to stay. So it would be beneficial for us to invest in this.
There's some real words of wisdom.
Yeah. Thank you to Al Gore. And I'm Adam Minihan here with Deacon Garlick. We're on book 21. The end is in sight. Thanks for hanging out with us for 20 weeks. We're on the 21st week. We're now able to drink on the show. The show has now reached the age of being able to drink legally. Okay, so hot take, Deacon Garlick. This is the new tradition that we have, or we're trying to make it a tradition. Like once is just an instance, twice becomes a trend, then the third time I think really establishes a tradition. I don't know if that's actually accurate, but this is like in my mind how.
Do I have to answer, or can I just kind of go on?
No. You have to answer. I mean, this is part of the shtick now. This is something that we do. Okay, so all right. So the hot take for this for today would be on desserts, and it's going to be.
Is this why you took such a long time to pause before we started the show? Because you were thinking of a hot take question?
No.
Oh.
I already told you why I paused in the middle of it, like at the beginning of the show. Remember?
No.
Okay. Well, you can go back and listen. Hot take on desserts. Are you a pie guy or are you a cookie guy?
Cookie.
Chocolate chip?
No.
Which one?
So my daughter actually just made these.
So I had
wonderful
a rhyme and reason for this. Go ahead.
Okay, so
I've also become now
my
that I told you
daughter
to go,
just.
become the pin flipping guy in the.
You know what? I can just be quiet. I'm just gonna let you talk on the show, and you can just keep.
Like I can do the. I've been that has been my shtick at the end of the episode. I've been throwing down the pin. If you're just now tuning in, or you haven't looked us up on YouTube, go check us out because then you can see me flip the pin at the very end of the episode. Something.
I'm sure
that
that's
you will
a
enjoy.
real highlight that brings a lot of people to the podcast.
But let's talk about your beautiful daughter who is very smart and takes after her mother in almost all ways.
So she made some amazing cookies. So for our Iliad Sunday Great Books reading group, and so I brought it on the show I think before that graphic novel. That's actually turned out. We've read it together now. So she read it herself, and then I read it to her. So we just read one book a night, and it tracks really well with the actual Iliad. So obviously it's condensed in certain ways. But if you're looking for something to read your a little bit older children, she's 9 or so, and so it's probably a good age. I think she read it by herself.
She's 9 or so.
Very quickly, right? Depends on when the podcast comes out. So
I see.
So anyway, it's a really wonderful read. I read it with her. It spawned a lot of good conversations. And then when we had Sunday Great Books, she wanted to do something nice, which I thought was very hospitable of her. And so she created these Iliad cookies. And so what she did was they were little sugar cookies, little round sugar cookies. And in the graphic novel, it doesn't say, like if it has like a quote from Agamemnon in the story, it doesn't say, said Agamemnon. Right, the speech bubble is just to Agamemnon. Well, this means you have to be able to determine who the characters are just by looking at them. So one of the ways that they did that is that everyone has like a very particular shield that somehow reflects, their particular traits. Right. So for instance, like Odysseus' shield in the graphic novel has like an owl on it. Right. So she had 2 plates. One was warriors, and one was gods. And so the warriors one had all these different shields from the book, and like obviously like Ajax's shield was like the largest, sugar cookie and things like this. And then on the gods, she had like a little thunderbolt for Zeus, a harp for Apollo. She had waves for Thetis. She had fire for Hephaestus. She had a skull for Hades. Like they were really fun. It was
that was really good.
We did some together, and she had this like metallic kind of paint on stuff that she could do, and it was a lot of fun. We had a good time out of it.
Hot take: Ecclesiastes or Psalms? Which one do you like better?
Psalms.
Psalms. Ecclesiastes is pretty good though.
It's not bad.
Okay. All right.
So, yeah. Okay.
Good hot takes.
Are we going to talk about Achilles fights the river now?
That is the plan.
Or
yeah.
We forgot to talk about Sartiange.
Oh yeah, we need to talk about
all the things you just made up. That was great.
My boy, yeah. Let's talk about my boy. Yeah.
Okay,
go
so
ahead.
just a quick plug. So if you are watching on the YouTubes, we'll hold it up.
Sartiange.
I'm gonna hold it to every camera and expect you to do all the cutting to make that work.
Thank you.
So this wonderful little book by a French Dominican, Sartiange, The Intellectual Life, Its Spirits, Conditions, and Methods, which if I remember by memory is an early 1900s text, right? Isn't it like 1920, if I remember correctly? And anyway, I just
thought it was earlier than that.
It could be. I apologize. Probably should have looked at that beforehand. So,
but you're probably
no, it's 1920.
Yeah, you're probably right.
So, I just want to plug this book really fast because obviously one of the reasons we read the great books is simply because we realize, hey, I don't have all the time in the world. So if I'm going to dedicate my time to reading books, I probably need to read the great ones because that's actually what's going to impact my life. It's going to form me as an excellent human. Like it's going to help me understand my culture. Like we read the great books. So this book, I would argue, is actually a great book. It's kind of a hidden gem. It used to be pretty standard in Catholic seminaries pre-Vatican II. And a lot of people are like very familiar with, say, St. Francis de Sales, the
Intro to Devout Life.
Yeah, thank you. I just blanked. I'm glad you're here. So I would say that this book is that for your intellectual life, right? How do I actually start to cultivate a life of the mind? And it is, if you're not familiar with like, which most people aren't, like a French Dominican style, it is very deep, but it reads very beautifully. It uses a lot of metaphors, but just a lot of like very quotable lines. We should probably spend like a topical episode and just go over this at some point.
That would be fun.
Because it's, and like, I know Dr. Malash, who we've had on the podcast, really enjoys this book. We actually recommend this to all of our diaconate candidates coming into the program, right? And so the thing I do want to stress and maybe testify to my own life is that one of the things he really pushes you in this book, and if you can read anything, just sit down and read the first chapter, the intellectual vocation, because I think that's kind of unsettling enough to actually, cause some proper effects in your life. And so for me, one of the things he really pushes on is he's like, hey, even if you are like a factory worker, you can cultivate an intellectual life. And one of the things he really pushes you on is that how do you structure your day, right? How do you structure your day? And have you structured it in such a way that you're actually using all your time wisely? And so one of the things is when I read this book is I realized I got up at like probably 7 and had like a little bit of time before work, went to work. And then, I got home, had family time, and then I might read a little bit, but my mind was tired. And inevitably, what do? You end up watching, Netflix or something for a few hours, and it's 11 o'clock and you go to bed. And so I just realized, and one of the things he pushes you there is you need to restructure your day. And this is the book that really convicted me. And this is the book that got me to start waking up at 5 a.m., right? Every day, up at 5, right? I wake up, I go put the coffee on, I go back, sit down, I do lauds, I get up.
What's lauds?
Morning prayer.
That's just
for
breviary, right? For our non-Catholic friends.
Right, yeah. Good question. All right, so our morning prayer that all clerics and religious are actually under a vow of obedience, right, to actually do. Vow might be the wrong word there. We have promised to do them at ordination, right?
Is it on the pain of mortal sin?
No, it's actually not under pain of sin at all, actually, now after Vatican II, which we could debate at some point. So, then walk out with a cup of coffee, let the chickens out, come back, sit down, and then it's time to read. And so like right now, right, I wake up in the morning and I'm working through the Iliad, right? A slow, attentive read. The world is quiet at 5:30 in the morning. And, I've got, my world starts, in the summers. The kids, generally wife, kids, everyone's up about 7. So I've got a good hour and a half of quiet time to read and cultivate a life of the mind. So anyway, we could talk a lot about the book, but if you're looking, I just want to recommend it because if you're looking and saying like, listen, I love getting into great books. I've enjoyed the podcast. Like, how can I sink these lessons like more into my life? Like, I just don't want this to be an intellectual exercise. What I mean by that is maybe one that's more academic. It's kind of removed from who I am and how I live my life. But I actually want to take these lessons and actually use it to actually form and shape myself into like an excellent human being. This is a great book to read. And this is a book that is well worth your time. Even if you literally are just like, read chapter 1. Actually, I think Father James Shaw, wrote the introduction. Wonderful old school Jesuit. Just don't make them like him anymore, right? That it's well worth your time. So I just want to throw that out there. If you're looking for it, maybe at some point we'll do a little topical podcast on it.
That'd be great. This indirectly at first changed my life because obviously our friendship changed the way I took seriously my intellectual life, and like ordering my day, which you got it from this. And then naturally I was like, well, let me read it myself. And so like this book changed my life without a doubt. So highly recommend it. It talks about friendship in there as well. Another good topic.
Correct.
So
yeah, very good.
Achilles fights the river. Let's do it. Let's talk about book 21. We're on it. We're almost all the way through. This is obviously going to be the chapter when the horse comes in. So get ready.
The horse. Good. I thought you were talking about the talking horse for a minute.
Oh, no.
We did talk about him.
Not Achilles talking horse.
The other horse.
The other horse.
Right. Okay, good. All right, so what do we see here? So Achilles basically kind of splits the Trojans. Half of them run into the Xanthus River, as we talked about in our opening narrative. And so then he just goes and leaps like a frenzied god in the waters, his heart racing with slaughter, only his sword in hand. So he is just slaughtering people, right, in this river. And this is also, just as a point that we should probably take note of, this is line 30. This is where he takes the 12 young Trojans, right, that he rounded up from the river and took them all alive as a blood price for Patroclus's death. So one of the things we've already seen is he's promised Patroclus a human sacrifice at his funeral pyre. And which is something that obviously, once we get there, really needs to be kind of contemplated. And what does this mean for Achilles? What does it mean to actually have this human sacrifice, right? It brings human sacrifice back into the Iliad narrative, as we saw with Agamemnon, right? Sacrificed his daughter kind of before Homer picks up the story. So this is where he gets the 12 young Trojans, right? And make sure to actually throw in that fact.
That'd be the worst, to get captured and be like, knowing like, here's your fate.
It's not great. Speaking of people who get captured, and it's really unfortunate, he jumps back to the river, and this time he takes a spear with him, and he ends up capturing Lycaon, right? And who is Lycaon? Well, unfortunately, it's a Trojan he had already captured once and sold into slavery, who then had his own little odyssey and finally made it back to Troy. And actually, he's only been home for 12 days, and then he is captured by Achilles again.
If it wasn't for bad luck, he'd have no luck at all.
That's right. I think the gods hate him, and he kind of feels that too. However, I think we need to note on a more serious level is the dialogue between the two. So if you look at like a line 110, they're going back and forth. And obviously Lycaon is hugging his knees. He's doing this. This has not been overly successful in the history of Achilles, but we're seeing
Last guy did, his spleen gut, or his liver gut opened up.
Yeah, and his dark blood poured out.
Yeah.
So not a strong track record. But I think what Achilles says to Lycaon is worth noting. So we're at like a line 115, right? And he's answering this call, right? So of saying, Lycaon saying, take me for ransom, right? He says, but now not a single Trojan flees his death. Not one the gods hand over to me before your gates. None of all the Trojans, son of Priam, least of all. Right, because Lycaon is actually a son of Priam, right? So he's saying, listen, every Trojan I get dies, right?
I love this next line.
And this is the line I think we need to unpack. Come, friend, you too must die. Why moan about it so? Even Patroclus died, a far, far better man than you. And look, you see how handsome and powerful I am? The son of a great man, the mother who gave me life, a deathless goddess. Even for me, I tell you, death and the strong force of fate are waiting.
Okay, so do you think that he was being sincere here whenever he says, come friend, you too must die? Or was he being like facetious?
Yeah, I think that, so my read is characterized, it's a line that just stands out.
Yeah,
right?
of course.
It just stands out. And so Knox, so if you're reading along with us on the Fagles translation, Knox actually gives the opening introduction. And this is a passage that Knox actually spends a lot of time trying to unpack. And I thought his thoughts on it were quite helpful, informative to my own, which is really that, no, I think he's being serious here. He's not saying, no, we get tripped up on lines by like, see how handsome and powerful I am, right? Because it's hard for us to imagine that like even in a normal setting, right? Where you're not just being a sarcastic jerk. Right.
I may try to bring that back, am I off?
I actually have no doubt. Like forward to that, bringing that into a chancery conversation meeting. Guys, I think we should film this video. Do you see how handsome and powerful I am? So anyway, I'll try an illegal argument. I think the friend line here is very, very sincere, right? I think that again, we have a perception here that Achilles is on some kind of arc, some kind of upward movement towards deification. And I think here, all of a sudden, seeing how he's embraced fate and death is part of that. Because in a certain way, his coolness about this, right? Not only in how he reflects on death, but by the way, I'm about to kill you, right? The whole is just, it's very subdued, right? Of just like this here, I am embracing death. And I think that there's a certain fraternity here that he's taken under death, under fate, where it really is a true, I would say, friendship, or at least a true relation that we're all bound by this, right? So even if Patroclus could die, as wonderful as he is, and even if I can die, right, do I not look like an immortal god? I think that's the actual argument, right? Look how powerful I am. Look how handsome I am. I look like a god, right? I look like one of the immortals, right? And again, think of that deification. Even I will die. And if I die, who are you not to die?
Right.
And so I think that in this line, death and the strong force of fate are waiting. We're going to maybe talk towards the end, or maybe I can mention it now in passing unless I forget it. If you, this theme of the strong force of fate, right? If you you can almost take this as that fate itself is the main character of the Iliad, right? Who actually moves things? Who's moving the gods? Who's moving the men? Who's moving all of these things? Where does the animation in the Iliad actually come from? It comes from the strong force of fate. And if that captures your imagination, that is drawn from a very famous essay by, oh my gosh, her name is going to escape me. Is it Simone Weil? Shoot. I knew if I try to mention it, it's going to escape me. She writes right in the middle of World War II. And so she writes on the strong force of fate. Obviously, she's watching all of these things that have happened during World War II. And her essay on fate is incredibly haunting, and is something that actually a lot of people turn to as kind of a guide for the Iliad. And it's very clearly that then she's kind of driving a parallel between her own time with some of just the crushing fates of World War II, right? Because, like, really the idea there is, like, can men really do anything? Can the gods really do anything? Can we do anything about the situations we find ourselves in? No. It's just the crushing form of fate that comes in.
Yeah, and I think it's very interesting right after that, this another maybe human element of Achilles, even though we're talking about the deification, like maybe to counterbalance or give a level take on it, is afterwards he mentions about 125 or so that he's not actually sure how he's going to die. Right? So he says, I don't know, maybe flinging a spear perhaps, or whipping a deadly arrow off his bow. Like, he's not sure.
Where's this?
125?
Oh, 125.
I believe, yeah. There will come a dawn or sunset or a high noon when a man will take my life in battle too, flinging a spear perhaps, or whipping a deadly arrow off his bow. Which I also think is interesting because later on, I think in this book, actually, it may be the next book.
No, it is in this book. If I intuit what you're going to say.
Yeah, where it talk about how
he gives an insight into his own death in this book.
Right.
So it's actually interesting. That's really interesting that you pointed that out. I did not catch that. So at 125, he does say that, flinging a spear perhaps, or whipping a deadly arrow. And then we might as well just go ahead and talk about it.
Okay.
So if you go and jump to 315.
I was trying to find it.
Yeah, it's 315. So this is that wonderful line where, I'm sorry, allergies, apologize. So this is a wonderful line where he's basically being defeated by the river god, Xanthus. This is it. And he has this wonderful line, right? Like, don't let me die like some pig boy that failed to ford the river, right? But he does actually above that say, right, that his mom told him, I will die beneath the walls of the armored Trojans, cut down in blood by Apollo's whipping arrows. So it's interesting here that when he's faced with his own death, very clearly, not just like somewhat contemplating it, but actually being tossed about into the waves, he's very clear on what his mother said. I'll be cut down outside the walls of Troy by Apollo's whipping arrows, right? And yeah, it's interesting then that when he's then kind of giving this more reflective understanding of death, he says, maybe a flinging spear, perhaps. He actually knows more than that. That's an interesting insight. I wonder why without the pressure of death, he seems to be more flippant about it.
Mm-hmm. And I think, it may have been last book or later on in this book. It talks about how, like, how they can't believe that they're using a bow because it's like it's less of like it's like, oh, you're using a bow instead of
him dying by an arrow is somewhat like in a certain way.
Oh yeah, it's
ignoble.
540 right here. It says Artemis is talking about Artemis. Sorry, it says like he talks about 540. Like, why do you sport that bow? You spineless fool! It's worthless as the wind. Like, I don't know. I saw all of those and I was like, huh, that's kind of interesting that he doesn't really know exactly like how he's gonna die, but between all those, I know. I thought that was interesting.
Yeah, and you see the bow kind of contextualized as, again, a lesser way to engage in warfare, and the fact that Achilles falls to that, right?
Now remember though, that bow is the lesser way to die. Mm-hmm. But then before that, as he was getting whipped around in the river, like you were talking about, like, was it 340 or so, or 320?
The Pig Boy episode?
Yeah, the Pig Boy episode. Like he was like, man, I just wish Hector had killed me.
Well, I would say that obviously his point there, right, is that being cut down by an arrow in combat outside of Troy is definitely better than dying like a pig boy who just failed to actually cross a river.
Yeah,
right?
but I think he's also saying, like, I wish Hector had killed me, like, in a way of, like, this would be more glory, like, it would be more glorious if Hector would have just killed me.
Yeah, no, of course.
So, I know, I saw all of those things as I was reading it, and I was trying to track that. I don't have a full fleshed out thought on it, but I just thought it was worth noting, especially as a first time reader.
No, I think that's good. We do see, as the Iliad progresses, we do see more and more of Achilles' fate revealed, right? Mm-hmm. So we see, as you pointed out, we knew he was going to die in Troy. Now we see that he's going to die under Apollo's whipping arrows, right? And we're going to get a little bit more clarity. I do want to jump back because my memory did serve. Simone Weil, her essay is actually referenced by Knox in his introduction to this text. And so if you're looking for kind of a wonderful little snippet, he has a whole paragraph, the opening line of the paragraph, just to kind of capture what I was talking about. The true hero, the true subject, the center of the Iliad is force. Force as man's instrument, force as man's master, force before which human flesh shrinks back. The human soul in this poem is shown always in its relation to force. Swept away, blinded by the force it thinks it can direct, bent under pressure of the force to which it is subjected. Those who had dreamed that force, thanks to progress, now belonged to the past, have seen the poem as a historic document. Those who can see that force today, as in the past, is at the center of all of human history, find in the Iliad its most beautiful and purest mirror. So it's a wonder. So it's not very long, and it's one of the most famous reflections on the Iliad that does take the strong force of fate, which again we're pulling from like 125 or so, is the actual character, right, of the Iliad, which kind of tethers, if you will, to all the conversations we've had about how fatalistic the Iliad can certainly be at times.
Yeah, I thought it was cool.
So,
I thought it was interesting, I should say.
Maybe we could put that in the show notes. Do you like that? I talk about show notes. I know. We don't ever talk about show notes. Man, I should not be the one bringing up show notes. I found out what show notes were when we started the podcast, so I'm just going to point that out. Okay. So the Lycaon, right, narrative continues, I think, in its depth and kind of showing us a few things. One, so around 130 or so. So I guess it was a good conversation, but maybe let's kind of sink it back into where we are.
Sure.
So Lycaon, son of Priam, poor man who's just been back in Troy 12 days after being sold into slavery by Achilles, is now recaptured by Achilles. Achilles gives this wonderful little narrative about, come friend, you too must die, which I think shows a certain fraternity under fate. I think Knox talks about like this certain fraternity of death, right, or a death cult. He might use some stronger language than I am. And so it's interesting then, how does Lycaon respond at like 129? His knees give way, his heart does too, but then he sinks down and spreads his arms out wide. right? In this kind of embrace of death. And whether you could say, well, is he really doing that, or is he just kind of going limp? Regardless, I would say Homer is definitely presenting this, right, in a certain caricature, a certain picture of him embracing death after this kind of pep talk, if you will, on the fraternity under fate, right?
And Achilles like does a good job, like as far as doing. This is a weird thing for me to say, but like he does a good job of like killing him swiftly.
You could say it's a clean death.
It's a clean death.
You don't get shoved through the navel,
right?
Or the worst, or in the
your liver gets sliced open.
Or the worst that what was it? The worst that the war god ever gives, right? Being speared between the genitals and the navel.
Yeah.
Right, this place where you're not going to die quickly.
Right.
Yeah. So no, I think it's a good insight. Right. A clean death means something. I will say though. So I want to piggyback off what you said. So there's a physical aspect of this, right? Then you immediately transfer into a spiritual. Right? Because he grabs the foot and he slings him into the river to wash downstream. Now we could, excuse me, hypothesize about like, why does he do that? Right? Why does he do that? Well, then he tells you exactly why he does it. Right? So much for your last rites. I mean, it's hard to explain this level of cruelty. Because for the Greeks, like we should probably point out here, particularly for this Homeric era, it just kind of goes back and forth in the myth and what happens and et cetera. But I think it becomes very clear, and it will become more clear as the Iliad goes forward, that if you don't get last rites, like this is your ticket. This is your ticket punched. You get to cross the river Styx.
Right.
You get to go into the house of death, which, for the record, we're not really sure if that's that great to begin with, right? Whether this is like there's a paradise or people are, it's not entirely clear.
Right.
You kind of think of like Sheol, the place of death that David talks about in the Psalms, right? Even David will say like, hey, don't let me die, Lord. If I die, I can't praise you anymore, right? So there's still this kind of like foggy understanding of the afterlife, right, that we're seeing in the Bronze Age. And so, but one of the things I think that Homer makes very clear is like, you don't have these last rites. You don't cross the river, or at least you have to wander around lost for a long period of time. And this is a lack of honor, right? You're mocked by the gods, you're mocked by the other souls, etc. And so for him to be tossing people intentionally back into the river to deny them their last rites is a certain level of, what do we want to call it, a spiritual cruelty.
So I could hear people like yelling at us right now on the podcast. Like, you just told us he's a friend. Like, to take that like a literal translation. Like, no, he's not saying that facetiously. He's saying like literally, like, come on, friend. And then that's not a very friendly way.
Okay, that's good. No, that's good. I enjoy the pushback. I would say that friend there is, we shouldn't read this in a thick, like Aristotelian sense of like, I wish the good of the other.
Okay.
Right? It's clearly that is not the case.
Well, yeah, because he kills him.
And this is also, but the thing is like, so if you think about, let's use Aristotle as just like a quick guide, right?
Okay.
So if there's three types of friendship, so you've got a friendship that the good, right? The perfect friendship. If I actually wish the good for the other, that's clearly not this. The other one is a friendship of utility, right? So like coworkers could be, or like you and I come together on a project, and our friendship is really tethered to a project. It's not actually tethered to these, but it's good for you and I to work together. That could actually be somewhat related to being soldiers, right? Fighting in Troy, right? That's not this either. And then the other one is like a friendship and pleasure. We enjoy doing the same thing, and that's the foundation of our friendship. That's clearly not this either. So I guess simply because we don't think he's being sarcastic or cruel when he says friend doesn't mean it's actually a true friendship. I guess to sharpen that, what I would say is what he's flagging here is a true relation. You and I both, I guess that's what I meant by this fraternity under fate. You and I are both subject to this. Even I have to be subject to fate. Even Patroclus has to be subject to fate. Who are you not to be subject to fate, right? And Achilles, in a certain way, being an instrument of fate. Because, so it's good. So friend there isn't sarcastic particularly, or even necessarily cruel. It is a real relation, but it's not a true friendship. It's good to push back on that, because obviously then Achilles' cruelty, that rage, we shouldn't lose sight of that. Because one, he tosses him for him to lose his last rites, and then just a few lines down, right, he's talking about the fish eating Lycaon's glistening fat. So not only is he just like relishing in this cruelty, he then just goes on, die, Trojans, die till I butcher all the way to sacred Troy. Run headlong on, I'll hack you from behind. Nothing can save you now. Right, I just wrote out, there's next to it, there's this bloodlust.
Yep.
Right. So, I mean, Achilles, and right now I think we're still getting into, I mean, I think you could tether the cruelty to Achilles maybe becoming more godlike, right? That now he actually has this spiritual cruelty, right, of denying these people their life. And it's not just him, right? He's killing lots of people in the river. He's clogging the river, right, full of their
He's a
corpses.
beaver.
Right. He's a perverted, inhuman, grotesque beaver.
Yeah.
Yeah, I like that. That's good. That is definitely, you heard it first here on Ascend the Great Books podcast. That is an original
This is
insight.
why
This text is 3,000 years old. And Adam Minihan just gave us an original insight. Achilles,
the beaver.
The macabre, perverted, inhuman beaver.
You're welcome.
That's good.
You're welcome. Okay.
So, so this transitions well then into,
Asteropaeus.
we're gonna call him Aster, Asteropaeus, Aster. So he's Aster. So he is like Fagels has a wonderful pronunciation guide, and I'm still struggling. I apologize. This is where we play the Oklahoma card. So I'm from the country.
Come on, y'all.
Yeah, come on, y'all. Let's just do this better. Okay. So this guy is not a son of Xanthus. He's a son of Axius, a different river, but we're getting very thematic here. He is also two-handed, so he kind of runs in with these holding two spears. This was actually really interesting in that graphic novel I bought my daughter to watch this guy like run in with like two. It's very awkward looking. You gotta think like you can't throw your whole body behind it, right? Because so it was weird. Anyway, I'm not really sure. But then the guy doesn't carry a sword.
Yeah,
right?
I think that was
he throws both of them.
the guy doesn't have foresight. Okay, he hasn't thought past. Once I throw both spears, then what?
Yeah, this doesn't. This does not work out well for him. So anyway, he throws both spears. They don't hit. Achilles throws his spear. It misses. The problem then is Achilles' spear gets stuck in the riverbank behind him. The guy Aster goes to grab it and pull it out. He doesn't have the strength to pull the spear out of the riverbank, and Achilles just comes up and kills him. It's very grotesque, actually, slashing out his life, slitting his belly open, a scooping slice at the navel, and all his bowels spilled out on the ground.
Ugh.
Which, by the way, is incredibly intentional by Achilles. This guy is pulling on a spear in the riverbank. I mean, you clearly could have just decapitated him. You could do it, and this is a clearly shooting for, well, I guess for your insight earlier, a not clean death.
Right.
This is a terrible death. Our Sunday Great Books had some interesting insights into this, I think, because which I realize I'm probably far afield on this. The first time I read it, it was hard for me not to read this as some type of betrayal, because like really, you're a son of the river, and the spear gets stuck in the riverbank, and you can't get it out. Like, because it seems like, do they not have the gods don't have control of the riverbank? Like, because it seems like if this was done in the reverse, you would clearly read it as the river is assisting him in fighting Achilles, but he can't get it out. Now, most of the guys I think had probably more straightforward read, which is leaning more on, well, Achilles is so much stronger.
The strength of
that's
Achilles,
what it's showing is that this guy can't get out, and also we've had a narrative already that obviously like this spear, right, that he carries can't be wielded by anyone else, and so maybe this is another thing we toss at the deification of Achilles, that he's just so much stronger than everybody else.
A Thor complex.
Sure, right? It's somewhat akin to that, right? No one else can wield this spear, maybe even literally, right? So anyway, just a aside as we do that. So the river has had enough, right? Xanthus swirls up. So this is like 240. And then he gives this wonderful quote that we've kind of referenced a few times already, right? All my lovely rapids are crammed with corpses now. No channel in sight to sweep my currents out to sea. I'm choked with corpses, and still you slaughter more. You blot out more. Leave me alone. have done, captain of the armies, I'm filled with horror.
I think it's interesting right before that, like as he's, just putting up more and more bodies. Homer calls it, he killed in a blur of kills. This is like 136 or something like that. I thought that was a cool, a unique way of saying, like, because you can imagine, right? As a soldier, I mean, you're getting into that mode. It is just kind of a blur,
Right.
I think everybody's maybe who's a sports person or something, like you've been in this sports moment and
he's in the zone.
You're in the zone. Yeah.
Yeah. So
tiger vision. He has tiger vision here.
Eyes of the tiger.
Yeah.
Right. Very good. So Achilles says, yes, Commander, I'll follow what you say. Then he overhears Xanthus telling Apollo, hey, what are you doing? I thought you were supporting the Trojans. Achilles then can't stand this. He rages. He jumps and plunges at the heart of the river to fight him. I think this is where I kind of want to throw out the notion that the arc of Achilles' deification starts to come back down. Now, granted, I think it might peak back up. Maybe this isn't a clear arc and a descent. Maybe this is a roller coaster. But I think maybe broadly speaking, a safer take is that he definitely finds a boundary, right? His rage finds a boundary. Because what happens? He finds against the river. He does not deal well.
Right.
The Xanthus is beating him, clearly. Yeah. It even makes some comments that, it beats against his shield and it doesn't help, right?
Yeah. It says in there, so the relentless tide kept overtaking Achilles. Yes, for all of his speed, gods are stronger than men.
Right. So our demigod, right, that is somewhat on an arc of deification is maybe hitting his ceiling in a certain way, right? Maybe not against humanity, we'll see, but against the gods. So then we get this wonderful thing where, help, don't let me die like a pig boy. Clearly this would run contrary to his choice to have a glorious death in Troy. Poseidon and Athena save him, tell him to have courage. This is kind of an interesting picture we typically don't get of Achilles, right?
No, I agree. Yeah.
It's basically not fated to him to die now. Xanthus, however, doesn't quit. So Xanthus calls on his brother, the other tributary river outside of Troy, to, hey, let's merge, let's rush together. And I think that there is something worth noting here. Xanthus says, this is at 360, I tell you, nor all that glorious armor now. Somewhere under our floods that gear will sink, immersed in deep slime, and I'll roil his body round in sand and gravel, tons of spills of silt. They will never know where to find his bones. So the point here, though, is that what Xanthus wants to do to Achilles is what Achilles just did to Lycaon.
Oh, yeah, very good.
Does that make sense? Like he's going to, because he'll be denied his funeral rites, right? So we see this kind of, I think there's a parallel between these two. So, however, obviously, this does not happen. Hera comes down, or I don't know if she comes down, but Hera is struck with fear and screamed out, right? It's very emotive, to Hephaestus, the god of fire, which is contrary to water, to come down. Hephaestus does come down. I think there's a few things to note about this. One is the first thing he does is he shot into flames and burned the plain and ignited the hordes of corpses. This is at 390. I think there's a natural question here is, does this count as the funeral pyre being burned in the flames of the god? So all these corpses are left out in the water, right? The water is clearly not going to get you your funeral rites. You need to be burned. Clearly, it's not also a full funeral rite.
So you think this is an act of justice in Hera, for Hera?
Oh man, I would be slow to attribute that to her. Hephaestus, though, does tend to be a kind-hearted god. It's notable. Excuse me. It's notable that Homer makes such a deal that Hephaestus burns the corpses. Like, it's mentioned several times.
Right.
And so
what was the first cause of that?
What do you mean?
I mean, the first cause of all of this was Hera struck in fear for Achilles.
Right. Which there's something to note about that too, which is simply that if you remember right, when Zeus freed the gods to go down and intervene, Zeus said we have to do this because Achilles might take Troy before the will of fate, and that's a whole conversation there. But then Hera gave the contrary one, which is we have to save Achilles, which is kind of an odd thing.
Right.
Now Hera's intuition is correct, so here she is saving Achilles. So her rationale for coming down is fulfilled. So Hephaestus then burns the corpses. So again, there's some questions here about the ritual. It even says he devoured all the dead. So I do have some questions about this, about whether or not this is an act of justice by Hephaestus, whether this counts.
Man, I did not catch that the first read. But I like that train of thought.
There's an aspect here that I really like, right? It seems very just. It seems that not only are they saving Achilles, which I'm not overly fond about, that doesn't strike me in any kind of emotive way, but that they're actually doing a justice to the souls slaughtered there does actually do something. So anyway, this works. The Xanthus cries out, right, for them to relent. Hera does relent. Oh, another parallel that I think is worth noting is that here comes Hephaestus, and he's burning the plains, and he's burning up all the corpses, right? So here's a god of fire, and all's being consumed by him. And I do think it's tempting to draw parallels, because what has been the main metaphor for Achilles' rage in the last couple books?
His fire, the
fire, right? The inhuman fire, like a frenzied god, like a chaotic fire. And all of a sudden, here comes a god of fire and burns up all the plains. I think there's.
It's also like fire is kind of mesmerizing as well. Like if you sit there and look at it, like you can just kind of stare. You can stare at fire for how long?
Right.
So I think that kind of may.
Yeah, there's something divine about it, right? That reminds me, I don't even know where I saw. I guess you can search Twitter and find such things. But I remember someone tweeted one time about talking to their child, and like a toddler, and being like, "Oh, what's the table made out of?" And it's like, wood. And it's like, oh, well, what is our fireplace made out of? Stone. And then they thought they'd be clever and be like, what's the fire made out of? And there's like a pause, and the kid's like, God. And it's like, the person's like, what? Right? Like, so, but no, I think there is like this kind of mystical underpinning, right? And fire overall. So Achilles is saved around 445 or so. This is where we get that wonderful line that Zeus heard the chaos enthroned on the Olympus heights, and it delights his heart, right? Kind of showing where he is. So anyway, then we get the clashing of the gods.
Can I
Oh yeah, go for it.
Like, just to piggyback off of last episode, because I made this whole thing with Aphrodite like laughing in the chaos, and we kind of figured out it was an epithet. But like, again, as a first time reader, my first thought after, because I read both book 20 and 21 before we actually discussed anything, right? So my first thought, I linked this passage about 445 to last book, to book 20 when we're talking about a theme of laughter in chaos. And we find, at least it may be unique to Homer in the Iliad, because the origin of Aphrodite doesn't seem to follow later on compared to what it does in the Iliad here. But even in 476, it talks about Aphrodite's the daughter of Zeus. And so, like, I think that could be something that Homer may have made up at this point in time. I don't know. Like, you have better insights than I do on this. But I linked this idea of like, okay, well, Aphrodite, who's the goddess of love, who is a daughter of Zeus, they both at this time had a deep laughter in the chaos of God's fighting.
Yeah, I did not track that. I didn't tether those two passages together. I'd have to.
I don't know.
I mean,
that may not be. Then that may just be incidental. But like I'm just giving first reader insights there.
No, I like that. Well, I think that's the type of reading that you have to do, right? This attentive reading and watch for repeated phrases and say, like, wait, is something being presented here? No, I like that. So then we got to get these pairing off of the gods, right? So Athena fights Ares again. Ares actually mentions, by the way, do you remember when you shoved that spear through me with Diomedes? Right, he's still a little upset.
As one would be.
Athena, again, owns him quite easily, it seems, right? So again, we're seeing why is the god of war falling to the god of wisdom, right? The goddess of wisdom. But I think we've kind of addressed this before, particularly when we saw Homer take up Athena's origin, like mythic origin of coming from the head of Zeus, that she is, I think she, over time, very much becomes the goddess of wisdom and what we might think of as wisdom. But here, right, we have to keep in mind she's the goddess of wisdom, but she also bears Zeus's shield. She's always having this helm. She has her own armor. She's very much linked, if not originally cast as, right, this military cleverness, right, this strategic warfare, right. And I think I think what Homer's showing us here, what the mythology is showing us, is that always beats the more chaotic, brutal, brash fighting.
Yeah,
right?
Athena
Which is what
seems to always
Ares
beat.
is, right?
Yeah.
Somewhat easily too.
Yep.
So then we have Aphrodite. So Aphrodite goes to help Ares, and then Hera's like, "Hey, by the way, there's Aphrodite." And so then Athena's heart.
That's actually an exact quote from Homer.
What?
Hey, by the way, there's Aphrodite.
It was close. She says, "Just look at them over there." That was close. And Athena's heart leapt high. She charged Aphrodite, overtook her, and beat her breast with clenched fists, and actually quite enjoys herself, right? Down you go. May all the gods who help the Trojans fall as hard when they battle Argives armed for war. So, I mean, a few things here. One, I think the beating on the breast is probably somewhat thematic, right, to the goddess of love, right? I don't think that's accidental. Two, in book 24, when we get there, Homer actually opens it with a lot of the origin stories of the Trojan War, the mythology that actually, hey, where's the Trojan War actually come from? And so it's something that's somewhat foreshadowed here, because what we'll find out is that there actually is, it's not that it's not that they're on different sides and why did they choose those sides, and that's something to be revealed, but rather there is actually a particular, say, hatred or disgust between Athena and Aphrodite, and actually between Hera and Athena on one side and Aphrodite on the other, right? So this kind of delighting and beating her has multiple layers. The other thing that I will point out here too is that even though it somewhat hit a ceiling, this kind of deification of Achilles, right? Okay, you are raging, the men are subject to you, particularly by the strong force of fate. However, the gods are not, right? You pushed a little bit too far with the Xanthus River. It is interesting that then in this kind of the parallel and this juxtaposition between Achilles' ascent and deification via his rage, and then this book ends with showing all this rage in the gods, right? And I think there's something very clear happening there in which we're seeing this rage to which Achilles is ascending. So then we get more pair-offs. Poseidon wants to fight Apollo. Apollo won't do it. And I think this is really interesting. He will not fight, right, this kind of elder god. And he kind of makes a point of that. And we get a few things here. This is where Poseidon again references the mythology that actually Poseidon was the one that built the walls of Troy. We've talked about this before in the Hercules narrative. And that Apollo, it's more clear here, Apollo's role was also in slavery, if you will, servitude to the king of Troy, but also was the shepherd caring for the cattle, I believe. So we kind of get a reference back to that mythology. Poseidon being like, hey, why don't you hate Troy, right? You suffered the same way I did. I also think that there's an insight here, which actually was offered in our Sunday Great Books, actually by Thomas, who's actually joined us on the podcast before, Thomas Lackey, where he gave a commentary here that Apollo seems to be the one who always considers boundaries, excuse me, like what's right and what's wrong and what should be done, right? So here, like, he won't fight Poseidon because Poseidon's an elder god. We'll see at the end of this book, he goes back to Troy because Troy can't fall before it's deemed in fate. So he kind of threw out this perspective, which I'm still entertaining, that Apollo seems to be more sensitive to the particular boundaries that are set up, which I thought was a good insight. So you also get Artemis makes fun of Apollo, right? And I think this is part of the cruelty that we're talking about, the rage. Actually, if you look at like 545, it actually explicitly states that Hera flies into a rage and then beats Artemis, right? Somewhat cruelly, actually. There's also a play here, I think, off their patronages. Hera watches over women giving birth, right? Women in labor, which obviously there's an irony there, right? Because then she hates when Zeus gets people pregnant and etc. But also, I know, just marriage and adultery, whatever.
Yeah.
So
that whole thing.
Just side note.
Right.
But also 551, right? She actually points out that Artemis has this contrary patronage where Artemis, which is one of the virgin gods, Zeus lets her kill mothers off in their labor, right? So it's interesting because there's multiple things going here. There's the Troy-Achaean debate. There's Artemis caring for Apollo and getting beaten, and then now there's also this contrary patronage might be the wrong word, but right, there are different aspects of their godhood are actually in conflict here.
Wow.
Okay, then Hermes oddly won't fight, and actually just tells Leto, "Hey, Leto's the mother of Apollo and Artemis. You can even tell people you beat me." And then that allows Leto to actually go gather up the bow and arrows and Artemis and take her up to Olympus. And then you get a juxtaposition where she sits on her father's lap, a young girl sobbing, crying about what's been done to her. Zeus giving a low, warm laugh, which is in complete contradistinction to earlier where he's delighting in the chaos.
Right.
He actually delights in this abuse, right? So then the passage ends then, if you recall, we said, remember, there's a certain contrast between why the gods had to intervene. Hera said we have to save Achilles. We've seen that come to fruition. Towards then the end, 595, now we see that Apollo has to go back to Troy to stop the Achaeans from taking Troy, particularly Achilles, before fate allows. And this is actually what Zeus said, right? So both Zeus and Hera's insight into why the gods are loosed actually comes true in Book 21. So what do? We end, with the story of Agenor, which basically, long story short, he's a Trojan. He turns Apollo. All the Trojans are running into Troy, right? This is full blown retreat. Apollo strengthens Agenor to turn around and actually take on Achilles. Now, this has been a mixed bag when Apollo gets someone to do this, but he has courage. And
you give it up to Agenor for doing it.
He did it. And so he turns around, and then he engages Achilles, and then basically there's this really fascinating thing where Apollo then basically whisks Agenor away, and then takes his place as basically a shade or a clone of Agenor, and then runs away. And Achilles takes the bait. He runs after him. The intention being here that Apollo leads, Achilles away from Troy.
And just as a little note, Agenor did a pretty good job. Like he threw something at Achilles, and had it not been for Achilles' shin guard, like we talked about earlier, that's TM there. I trademarked
shin
that.
Guard?
Yeah, Achilles' shin guard. Had it not been for that Hephaestus made for him, his spear would have hit him true. So,
yeah, just looking at the guide, make sure we.
Well, can you say it in a little bit more excitement? Like just looking at the guide.
Oh, sorry.
Like, you were like,
no,
your guide is very, very good.
Sorry, I didn't mean it like that.
Okay.
No, I'm still kind of fascinated by the burning of corpses. I made a note there to kind of go back and look.
I
at
do
all
like
those
that.
things.
Yeah.
I like that theory. And then also just something I actually noticed kind of on this read through again was the parallels between what Xanthus is trying to do to Achilles is what Achilles did to Lycaon and also to other Trojans, right? And so I think there's actually some justice being done there. I think too, I'm tempted to do this, but I think it's maybe reading too much into it. But it's interesting to me that Achilles' deification, like we said, he kind of hits the boundary of, up against a god himself, right? And it's a minor god too. I think that's a point, right? It's not even that he battles an Olympian and loses. Right. He loses to this kind of minor god. But it struck me that I'm probably too tempted here to make a deal of this, that it's a minor god directly connected to nature, right? And Achilles is becoming something unnatural, right? He's becoming an Olympian god. He's becoming something. He's becoming something inhuman, which is actually a language that Homer's been using, right? This kind of inhuman fire. And so it's just interesting to me and notable that Achilles bumps up against a god of nature and that undoes him.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, for a weird book to be thrown in the middle of like me wanting Achilles and Hector to fight, you know, and Hector being whisked away, and then like, okay, like where is this going to be? Like the first time, you know, obviously the first time I've been reading this, I thought at least it was very entertaining. I didn't know why, like,
right.
you know, why this was in here at this point in time, but it was an entertaining book.
Yeah, I'm right there with you. The first time I read it as a first-time reader, I was very perplexed. Why?
Yeah.
Why is this in here? Why are we having this whole passage? I think a lot of it gets unlocked when you look at the last couple books as a deification of Achilles,
Yeah.
particularly via his rage as that medium, and then to watch it kind of find the boundaries makes a lot more sense.
Next week's gonna be pretty epic.
Yeah,
We had a big one.
Book 22, the death of Hector.
So make sure you subscribe to our podcast if you have not already. Share it with your family and friends. We'd like to hear from you, especially if you guys are having your own little Sunday's great books like we've been talking about on our end. And we will see you guys next week.
Thank you.